Thanks very much, Jake, and good morning, everyone. And I will jump right into the award presentation. So today we're presenting the Yentsch-Schindler Award, which honors an early career scientist for outstanding and balanced contributions to research, science training, and broader societal issues such as resource management, conservation, policy, and public education. And today we have the pleasure of presenting this award to Hilary Dugan for her exceptional, balanced contributions to our understanding of salinization of freshwater ecosystems and winter limnology, and for her commitment to scientific mentorship and impact creation via proactive open science translation to resource managers and the public. Hilary's research and subsequent publications is one of the three facets of her contributions which were recognized. The second is her excellence in mentoring and fostering open collaborative science practices. Hilary's mentoring and teaching reach far beyond UW-Madison. She's been a champion for open science and ensuring that students and researchers all around the world and at all career stages have access to high-quality training, data, and tools that allow us to leverage the power of cutting-edge technologies and to scale our work to the global scale. Finally, Hilary has a clear commitment to share her science and make it accessible to all. It is my pleasure to welcome Hilary Dugan.
And as president of ASLO, it's my sincere pleasure to present this Yentsch-Schindler Early Career Award to Hilary Dugan. And I do this on behalf of the ASLO board and the hard work of the awards committee. And just a reminder, please nominate your colleagues for an award. So.
Thank you. Perfect.
And just before Hilary begins, I just forgot to thank the subcommittee who did the hard work of selecting between the nominees. So thank you to all members of the subcommittee for this award.
Well, welcome to Madison. It's a great honor to be receiving this award on a hometown stage. Also, given the fact that I'm going to talk a lot about Wisconsin, it's convenient that you are here and you're able to see these beautiful lakes in Madison and this beautiful place. So, in reflecting on receiving this award, my career has never really followed a planned path, but it's the summation of working with a lot of kind, smart individuals that have inspired me on a daily basis to do what I do, and the public institutions that have supported me and my work along the way. So needless to say, there's no I in limnology. None of what I do is done alone. And so this award's really dedicated to the many, many people who have influenced me over my career, including my awesome colleagues at the Center for Limnology, many of whom are here today, my formal advisors and friends, Scott, Peter, and Paul, and all of my brilliant collaborators, especially those of you who are here. So I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's just down the road. If you get an opportunity, you should walk down State Street and check it out. Beautiful campus, lovely terrace you can have a beer on. And after 10 years of working at the university, I've been fully indoctrinated in the Wisconsin idea. And this is one of the longest traditions at UW-Madison, and it signifies this general principle that education should influence people's lives beyond the boundaries of the classroom. So the boundaries of the campus are the boundaries of the state. And it's, in essence, to me, it's a commitment to public service. And this mission, this motivation, I think aligns really well with the Yentsch-Schindler Award, named after two eminent scientists, limnologist David Schindler and oceanographer Clarice Yentsch, both people who used their stature as scientists to serve societal good. And as a Canadian kid who spent my formative years on the lakes of northwestern Ontario, it's quite an honor to be receiving an award named after David Schindler. So my nomination focused on two issues that I spend a lot of time thinking about. The first is freshwater salinization. So in the top left graph, you can see a plot of chloride concentrations in the three Madison lakes. So Lake Mendota over there, Lake Monona over there. And you can see for Lake Monona, it's risen from about 2 milligrams per liter in the 1940s to over 70 milligrams per liter today. So this is an issue that's happening globally. It's happening globally for a variety of reasons. But in this region, in the Midwest, it's mainly due to the input of road salt that we use as road de-icers in the winter. Second issue is the loss of lake ice. So similar graph, this is for Lake Mendota, tracking ice on and ice off dates over the last century. And you can see that over this time, we've lost about 1 month in the duration of lake ice. This is also happening to lakes globally, driven by climate change, mostly from rising air temperatures, in some places from changing snowpack. And I guess in reflection on this award is, why do I spend so much time thinking about these issues? And I think it's really because it's a lived experience. Every day I go to work and I get to see these wonderful lakes, but they're changing. And these lakes mean a lot to me. They mean a lot to people in Madison. And they provide a wealth of ecosystem services to this city and to this region. And I spent a lot of my early career working on some of the most remote lakes on the planet. And truthfully, I found it very fulfilling to work on these sort of local issues, although these local issues are also very global in scope. And so it comes down to these lakes that I care about are changing. And so I get pretty mad when I see just piles of road salt laying on the sidewalk in the winter. And to me, it's pollution. It's plain and simple. It's the same way that fossil fuel burning is pollution. Yes, we do it for a reason, and we all benefit from it, but we should be constantly thinking about how we can reduce it. And importantly, we, as limnologists, need to be convincing the Doloreses of the world that water quality is crucial for people's lives, right? That's why we're doing this. The salt that Madison puts down on its roads, it ends up in our drinking water aquifers. It's going to affect our health. And when people start making the connection between water quality and their health or their money, salting roads costs the taxpayers of the state about $80 million a year. Then you start seeing action. And it's exciting because people are starting to talk about this. Madison Reddit is the place to go if you have opinions on road salt or outdoor cats, also a contentious issue in this city. And it's not just a Madison problem, it's across the national news, and it's because of people in this room, right? Limnologists are the ones that are ringing the alarm bell on these issues. And we're doing the same for lake ice loss, right? It was all over the news this winter, talking about short winters and what they mean. And so I spent a lot of time talking about this in public settings, talking about salts and lake ice. Very exhausted between the months of January and March. I feel like I'm an anti-limnologist where I get to catch up in the summer on issues. But ultimately, as a scientist, what I strive to ask is, does this matter to lakes, right? We know that lakes are getting saltier. We have these amazing observational data sets that show this. So we have a lot of empirical observations, and they've allowed us to understand the drivers of salinization, the trends of salinization. We can leverage those data sets to make predictions, to understand where lakes are at risk. But we don't know a lot about the true ecosystem impacts of our freshwater lakes getting saltier. So the ultimate goal, in my mind as a scientist, is really to produce elegant science. And I know that sounds pretentious, but really it comes down to being able to produce clear, concise science that's useful to the public. And I want you to think about the most famous picture in limnology. I hope you're picturing the same thing I'm picturing. There's a beautiful setting in northwestern Ontario where David Schindler has installed a curtain across a lake and added phosphorus to one side. And the one side's bright green. And the resulting algal blooms really changed how the world viewed phosphorus, right? It was this really clear message about water pollution. And I also spent a lot of time thinking about Carpenter's table and achieving this goal. So in 1998, Steve Carpenter drew a table and said that ecosystem science is this table that's really born by these strong legs. They're all essential to the supporting the whole because they have these complementary strengths and weaknesses, right? So we have theory, we have long-term studies, we have experiments, and we have comparisons. And these methods have complementary strengths and weaknesses, and we can harness all of them to be able to create really great ecosystem science. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about some recent science that I think has provided new insights to some of these issues at hand. So I want to start with a paper that was led a few years back by Robert Ludwig, who's now a professor at Aarhus University. And the question we asked here was, how is salinization impacting lake mixing? With the focal lakes being Lake Mendota, Lake Monona here in Madison. And these lakes have this incredible long-term record documenting human salinization, right? These records go back to the 1940s, which is pretty rare. So we can really see how road salting in the 1950s kind of just took off, and the salinity of these lakes have been rising ever since. And we set out to answer this question using multiple approaches, so using empirical data as well as analytical solutions. And the hypothesis here is that salts are going to accumulate in the hypolimnion over winter, right? Salt is dense. You're going to get salty inflows from the rivers coming in during runoff. Those salts are going to sink to the bottom, create a dense hypolimnion, which may delay spring mixing. Linnea Rock, who's now a PhD student in Wyoming, had put in a bunch of conductivity sensors in the lake, and that was really insightful. It showed that when the ice came off the lake went isothermal really quickly, which is what you'd expect, but it wasn't fully mixed. There was still this really salty water at the bottom, and it didn't actually mix until about 2 weeks later. And this is something that we hadn't measured before because we didn't have conductivity sensors. Even if you had a temperature string out here, you would think that the lake was just mixing. So this was new empirical evidence that this is happening. And 2 weeks is a really long time in the spring, especially when your springs sometimes are pretty short. And then Robert applied theory. There's a critical amount of salt that's going to result in amixis during the spring. And we found that the critical salinity for Lake Monona is about 1.3 grams per kilogram. So this is sort of below the center of volume in the lake. And we're luckily not at that concentration, right? These lakes aren't meromictic. They haven't sort of reached that concentration of salts. But this isn't an unrealistic concentration that we see in rivers in the Midwest. We get very high salinity, surpassing this concentration routinely in the winter. And we do have lakes in the Midwest that have become meromictic. They just stopped mixing because there's so much road salt going into the bottom that the hypolimnions just become too dense, and overturning has basically stopped. So then in this paper, we also leveraged lake models to be able to run scenarios to see what salt entrainment actually looks like. So if you do put a lot of salt in the lake in the winter, what does that do to the water column? So in this paper, we used multiple approaches and found that we would delay spring turnover, prolong stratification, and increase water column stability. And this combination of approaches, I think, was really powerful in understanding how salinization is affecting these lakes, but from a physical standpoint. And this result is kind of just one piece of the puzzle, right? The fact that salinization affects lake physics implies that it's affecting oxygenation, especially in these lakes that go anoxic almost immediately when they stratify. And therefore, it's indirectly going to affect biogeochemistry. And that's not even touching on the direct effects that salinity has on biogeochemistry. And then there's all the direct and indirect effects on biology. And what's challenging is these are really hard questions to answer in urban lakes, typically because these lakes have multiple stressors, right? So if we see that Daphnia populations are decreasing in Lake Mendota, how do we decide that that's linked to salinization? When we have nutrient loading, we have pollution, we have climate change, we have invasive species, how do we untangle all these stressors to be able to draw conclusions about how salinity is affecting these lakes? And then experiments are also hard at the scale of a whole lake. Limnology is full of amazing whole lake experiments that have taken place, but adding a lot of salt to a lake is challenging, I do think, for one, just ethically, especially when my goal is to get people to stop adding salt to lakes. And then the last is this really interesting question about biology, which is what role does evolution play in these lakes that have been slowly increasing in salinity over decades? And so I want to highlight this, I think, this great 2023 PNAS paper by PhD student Matt Worsby. In this paper, he resurrected Daphnia pulicaria clones from a Minnesota lake that has undergone cultural meramixis. So it's currently like too salty to mix. And he resurrected these clones and showed evolution of Daphnia in a lake where clones from the top of the core had much higher salinity tolerance than Daphnia clones from lower in the core. So basically this paper shows that in this lake, Daphnia have rapidly adapted to increasing freshwater salinization. So this was, I think, sort of a great study looking at that question about evolution, but there's still unknowns, right? Daphnia have evolved, but are there trade-offs to Daphnia in that evolution? Are there trade-offs to the ecosystem? And I think we need to be asking the same questions about lake ice loss. So I've spent a good chunk of my life working on permanently ice-covered lakes in Antarctica with the McMurdo LTER site. These are some of the only permanently covered lakes on the planet. There used to be more, but they're starting to not be permanently ice-covered. And the way things are headed globally, there's a chance that in the future, these lakes also might become ice-free someday. And so the question, it's a fascinating question to ask, what does this mean for this unique ecosystem? And the way I see it, there's two sort of complementary questions when it comes to thinking about lake ice loss. There's a question of what are we losing? So what is currently happening in lakes in the winter? And this is really the question that the field of winter limnology has thus far focused on a lot. There's been some really great research going on answering that question. And then there's this corollary question, which is, if we're losing lake ice, what are the sort of full season ramifications of that, right? What does that mean for the spring and summer and the whole year in a lake? And Wisconsin lakes have been central to this body of research, thanks to the North Temperate Lakes LTER site, which has amassed some of the longest and diverse data sets in the world on lakes where we sample in the winter under ice. And because of that, because of the presence of the North Temperate Lakes LTER here in Wisconsin, we'd be able to leverage that to do some cool research here in Wisconsin. So we spent a few winters actually plowing snow off a lake. It's a tremendous amount of work. And this was to look at the role that light plays in influencing under ice lake dynamics. And this is sort of building on some of the hypotheses that were raised in a JGR paper by Emily Cavalier thinking about this lake ice continuum concept. And so we took a lot of empirical measurements, both on the experimental lake and a nearby reference lake. And I want to note here actually that the University of Wisconsin-Madison has been very supportive in funding infrastructure for this type of work, including field gear like winter boots and survival suits. And we've really managed to create, I think, a safe and equitable opportunity for students to come do field work without needing any gear, especially in the winter where these would be kind of harsh conditions to work in. And it's also resulted in, I think, cool science. This is an L&O paper led by Ellie Socha, who's now a PhD student at Cornell, and she showed that the plankton community responded to this snow removal experiment. You can see just in the test tubes that there was a lot of chlorophyll, which was pretty cool. And the zooplankton densities went from virtually 0 to a sizable number of rotifers. And we found that less snow meant more light, but it really depended on the ice quality. So this idea of sort of white ice versus black ice, and in these lakes, it really just depended on freeze-up conditions. So how did the lake ice freeze immediately, sort of in November when they started freezing? Interesting temperature dynamics in the lake. We found that more light did not result in warmer temperatures. Actually, the lake got colder, and it significantly increased plankton concentrations. But one of the limitations of this study was how does those significant changes in winter affect the lake later on in the season? So what we have been able to do is, again, sort of leverage these really long data sets from the North Temperate Lakes LTER, 40 years of data on Wisconsin lakes, to look at what role ice off plays in shaping spring and summer conditions, right? We've written so much about ice off dates changing, but there's much less research on why that's significant to ecosystems. So in this paper, what I tried to do is make the connection between lake properties, so things like water temperature and oxygen concentrations, water clarity, chlorophyll, to think about how lake ice might have an ecological memory on these ecosystem properties. And what I found was that it was very lake dependent, even across this really short latitudinal gradient that is the state of Wisconsin. So changing ice off date does not affect lakes equally. And this question was also addressed in this great new paper in L&O Letters by Vendi Hasukova. She studied lakes in Greenland, showing that when you have early ice out, the lake's actually able to mix and saturate with oxygen compared to late ice out years, where you get sort of persistent anoxia, which has all of these biogeochemical ramifications. And this is something that we actually see in northern Wisconsin. If we have these really late ice out years, sometimes the lakes don't mix in the spring and we get persistent anoxia. But we don't see it here in Madison. The lakes here always mix in the spring. And it's sort of showcasing that the location is really important biogeochemically in terms of how ice off date is affecting lakes across the world. It's not going to be a one-size-kind-of-fits-all answer. And then there's this question about biology. So in this perspective, led by Zach Feiner and CJFAS, we discussed the possible implications of increasingly unpredictable aquatic habitats in springtime. And this unpredictability comes from the fact that we're not actually seeing later ice off dates in northern Wisconsin right now. We were seeing a big increase in variability. So we have some years where the ice comes off really early, and we have other years where the ice comes off very late. And so if you have organisms that are adapted to environmental cues in the springtime, the question is what happens if these cues start shifting in really unpredictable ways, right? You have cues like temperature and photoperiod and light. And spring is this really important time to study phenology in lakes because of the tight coupling of trophic levels, right? We have spring phytoplankton blooms, we have the emergence of zooplankton, we have fish spawning. So if you were to have an early ice off year, right, the ice melts really early, can you decouple these events? What would happen if your spring phytoplankton bloom came really early, but was actually dying off by the time zooplankton emerged and fish started spawning? Would your zooplankton have the resources they require? Would the fish then have the resources they require? So can ice off timing uncouple food web responses with ramifications ultimately to things like recruitment success? So these are the questions we raised in this perspective. But Zach and undergrad Martha Barta followed this up in this recent L&O Letters paper where they used a large data set from Wisconsin lakes to show that ice off is shifting faster than walleye spawning date And then in extreme years, these really early and really late ISOF years, they're really bad for recruitment, both of them. And so this was just sort of one line of evidence that changing ISOF variability is impacting lake biology. And in this case, the biology of a very important fishery here in the state of Wisconsin. And this made the news big time in Wisconsin. Zach was on the radio for about a straight month talking about this. So if you want notoriety, study walleye. But in this case, this is a question of, is the biology going to be able to withstand this climate whiplash where we have one year that's very, very different than the next year? So to wrap this up, I want to kind of update Steve's table and say that good science is also coupled to outreach and education. They go hand in hand. And one important aspect of education that I both have benefited from immensely and also try and contribute to is this idea of open science. And I've learned so much from my collaborators who spent a long time thinking about this, people like Lindsay Platt and Michael Meyer and Matt Ross's team. And I've learned over the years that it has just so many benefits, right? It enhances the quality of science. Transparency allows increased scrutiny of research findings, scrutiny in a good way, by both you and scientific reviewers. So in the end, it just leads to more robust research papers. It saves time for the future you, not current you, future you. And it promotes collaboration, especially across disciplines. So some of the coolest science in my mind is when people take methods from other disciplines and adapt it. And this is really incredibly hard to do without being able to share resources, ideas, and methods. And this isn't a benefit, I think it's just the bottom line. If your data was publicly funded, it should be publicly accessible. And looking ahead, I think open science is just going to continue to grow, especially with new cohorts of grad students being trained in these principles. But none of us should fool ourselves that it's easy. It takes a lot of time and perseverance and commitment. And the goal is not to do it perfectly, but to try and do it as best you can. Because ultimately, it democratizes access to knowledge, and I think it drives innovation in science. Also, in receiving this award, ASLO asked me what advice I have for people interested in broadening the reach of their work for policymakers and working with communities. So I guess I'd say the first is just trying to understand the system you're working on, especially if it's local. I think one of the hardest parts about moving around in academia is just kind of fostering that local network. And it takes time. And luckily, I've been lucky to be in one place for 10 years and be able to grow that network. The second is to team up, right? Working with others obviously amplifies your efforts, but I think it also broadens your perspectives. And it's great when you find collaborators who really motivate you to keep doing what you're doing. And then the last is to prioritize. So this one's hard, but in the end, you just start to be selective about the opportunities you pursue. And that goes hand in hand with recognizing the importance of saying no. But ultimately, you're only one person. And unless you're Grace Wilkinson, you can't do everything well. So these tenets have been central to my work with Wisconsin Saltwise, which is an amazing organization here in Wisconsin aimed at reducing salt pollution. So if you're interested in this topic, check out wisconsinsaltwise.com. But under the leadership of Allison Madison, this group has done just incredible work across the state, and it's really, really motivated me to keep doing what I'm doing and keep talking about salt. For example, this past year, we actually got very close to a new bill being passed in the Wisconsin legislature that would limit legal liability to road salt applicators. So the idea here being, if you're willing to use less salt if you're not afraid of being sued. And it actually passed our Republican legislature and ultimately got vetoed by our Democratic governor. But like any good bill, we will try again. So one last story, because I have your attention. So when I was a young scientist, I submitted one of the chapters of my master's thesis to LNO. And at that time, all I knew was that LNO was just like this great limnology journal. This was way back when LNO made you make figures in Times New Roman font, which, if you know me, You know how I feel about that. Anyway, so I submitted this paper, I got the reviews back, and one of the reviewers, his name was John Gibson, he was at the University of Tasmania, and in his review, he gave me his email and said, like, hey, reach out, we can discuss one of these ideas. And this led to an incredibly fruitful exchange, which helped with the paper, but it really just showcased the generosity of this established scientist who was halfway around the world to some young kid in Ontario. And 14 years later, I still remember that experience. And I think this amazing support for students is something that epitomizes ASLO and the community that exists here. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening and doing what you're doing. A huge thank you to all the ASLO volunteers, especially all the journal editors and reviewers. I look forward to hearing about all of your amazing science this week and hoping you submit it to some of our great society journals. So thank you. And I am happy to take any questions, or feel free to come find me this week, and happy to chat about any of this. Go.
Thanks, Hilary, for a really wonderful talk. I'm just curious if you could talk to us about like your favorite road ice alternatives and what you think are some cool ideas for how to not do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, thanks, Matt, for that question. Question that comes up a lot. I think the first step is really just reduction, right? The aim of, the bill in the legislature is really to start thinking about places where we just oversalt because, we're afraid of not oversalting. So places like parking lots, sidewalks, there are a whole range of areas where we could significantly reduce road salt use with really not impacting public safety at all. And then it comes down to, I think the next step is technology. So what we've seen in Wisconsin is a pretty big switch in a relatively short time frame from road salt application to liquid brine application. So this is instead of dumping kind of salt on the road the way you saw that truck doing, where a lot of the salt just hits the ground and bounces off and then isn't even used. That's just pure pollution. If you spray it on as a liquid, it adheres to the road. You can have more control on where you're putting it. And so some of the counties in Wisconsin that have switched to brine application have seen about like 50% reductions in their salt use. So you can make huge strides in reducing the millions of tons we use a year just between smart salting and technology. And so I think those two are just the really realistic steps. And then you just start seeing new, kind of innovative technology where there's a lot of, waste heat production in cities that could be used to just keep parking lots warm. People have been experimenting with solar-powered bridges to keep them warm. So, I think there's a lot of innovation. It takes the will. Yeah.
Congratulations, Hilary. I'm wondering if you could comment on, because we measure chloride because it's the easier thing. It's been measured easily for many, many decades, as you pointed out. What about sodium? Because that's what's an anion or cation that's going with it. And I wonder if that has more toxicity and what you know about that issue.
Yeah. So the question is a great question about sodium. So yeah, we often in sort of the field of freshwater salinization, we talk about chloride a lot because we consider it an inert ion, so it's really easy to track anthropogenic pollution. But sodium's increasing in a lot of systems as well. And it's something that people track a lot in drinking water supplies. There's more impacts of high sodium on human health than there is chloride, and they kind of go hand in hand. So, definitely keeping your eye on sodium is important. And then it also leads to interesting cation exchange reactions in soil. And so you get, different impacts on the total cations coming into water as well. So, track all the ions. Sulfate has cool things that are happening. Yeah, thanks, Dick. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hilary. It is such an honor to have you as a colleague, and congratulations again. We would like to start the plenary today with a video, Our Past Can Shape Our Future.
I'm Representative Robert Pilot of the Ho-Chunk Nation, the people of the big voice. We've called this area home for thousands of years, but the beauty was created thousands of years before that. Let's travel back in time, way back, before Wisconsin was a state, before the United States was a country, way before Greek and Roman empires, and even before Ho-Chunk arrived to this sacred part of the world. We're here in Greater Madison, 15,000 years ago, but we're not standing on the ground. We're on top of a mountain of ice up to a mile thick. This is the Wisconsin glaciation, and it covered most of Canada, the upper Midwest, and New England, but a thaw is on the horizon. Over the next 2,000 years, we will witness the big glaciers start to melt and retreat. Where we once stood on ice is now a large lake stretching from present-day Middleton to Stoughton. Enter humans. 13,000 years ago, we would see the first human activity occurring around the shores of these waters. But the lakes hadn't divided yet, meaning distant ancestors of Ho-Chunk dwelled near a large, single water body later named Glacial Lake Yahara by geologists. But more change is coming. Moving to 10,000 years before present, we see water levels fall, separating into 4 current lakes and leaving shallow water marshes, including one that would later be turned into Lake Wingra. Along the area that the Ho-Chunk called Dejop, which translates to 4 lakes, early surveyors document the Ho-Chunk producing over 3,000 bushels of corn annually in Old Turtle, 4 Lakes, and Broken Arm, now known as Middleton, Madison, and Monona. At the center of Dejop, much like today, sits Lake Mendota, now known as the most studied lake in the world. The lake was once called Wakshak Ominga, translating to where the person rests. Dejop was a cultural epicenter for native mound building peoples, with evidence of over 1,200 effigy and burial mounds documented in the area, a concentration that rivals any other place in North America. The water is sacred too. The Ho-Chunk, with its massive ancestral land base throughout present-day Wisconsin and reaching areas of Canada and the Dakotas and into present-day Indiana, know the water has identity, a life, a meaning and a purpose,
2, 3.
deserving the utmost care and protection. They rely on water for fishing, wild rice harvesting, and transportation, but also treat it with a spiritual reverence as a living entity that provides so much to the people of Dejop and beyond. That important relationship with water has lasted centuries and has kept the Ho-Chunk Nation from its traditional clan duties to its modern-day government as protectors of one of the most important life resources. This is why the Ho-Chunk pour tobacco for the water spirits. In return, the water protects the people. It's been 13,000 years since humans first congregated here. The future holds promise, but perhaps the past can offer lessons to how we develop relationships with our lands and waters. As we move forward to make our lakes better, we must also look back and draw upon the lessons learned from the Ho-Chunk, who knew the protection and reverence to the water would in turn lead to a thriving community.